There comes a moment in life when we face a truth more bitter than betrayal itself, the moment when someone wounds us, perhaps deeply, and then proceeds as if nothing ever occurred. No apology, no recognition, just silence cloaked in normalcy. It's an experience so common, yet so profoundly disorienting, it can leave you questioning not just their motives but your own sanity. But what if I told you this behavior is not random? That it follows a hidden logic embedded in the structure of the human psyche? That their silence is not ignorance, but avoidance, not forgetfulness, but fear? Today, we dive deep into the psychological architecture behind why people hurt others and pretend as if nothing happened, and why your awareness of it is a sign of your growth, not your weakness. When someone wounds you and then moves on as though nothing happened, it creates an invisible fracture. In reality, it's not merely the pain of the act itself that haunts you, it's the eerie absence of acknowledgement, the unsettling silence that follows. You wait, perhaps not for a grand apology, but for a flicker of recognition. And yet, what you receive is the exact opposite. Casual conversation, normal behavior, hollow smiles, as if your suffering were either invisible or unworthy of concern. But this isn't forgetfulness. It's not ignorance. It's something far more calculated and deeply rooted in the psyche. Denial as self-preservation. At the core of this behavior lies the ego's desperate need to protect its image at all costs. The human ego, fragile and defensive, cannot withstand the full weight of guilt or shame. To admit wrongdoing would mean to accept a version of the self that is flawed, selfish, or even cruel. And this to the ego is intolerable, so it chooses a different path. It erases, it rewrites. It creates a narrative in which the offense was minor or didn't happen at all. The act of hurting you is compartmentalized, hidden away in the basement of the unconscious where uncomfortable truths are buried. From the outside, this looks like indifference, but internally, it's a psychological maneuver of survival. If they do not acknowledge your pain, then they are not responsible for it. If they can pretend the wound doesn't exist, then they don't have to feel the guilt of having caused it. This form of denial isn't always a conscious strategy. It operates below awareness, like a protective reflex. Just as a person might flinch away from physical pain, they flinch away from emotional accountability. In their internal narrative, they are still the good one, still the victim of circumstances, still justified in their actions. Your pain becomes irrelevant because it doesn't fit into their version of the story. It threatens the carefully constructed persona they present to the world, and more importantly, to themselves. To integrate the truth of your hurt would require a confrontation with their own darkness, and most people spend their entire lives avoiding that mirror. They are terrified of what they might see if they looked directly at it. So they don't. They carry on, smile, send a text, act casual, not because they've healed or grown, but because they've suppressed and silenced. They treat your pain as disposable, not because it is, but because acknowledging it would mean facing themselves. This psychological pattern is not limited to overt narcissists or pathological personalities. It exists in the everyday person, the friend who ghosts after a betrayal, the family member who causes deep hurt and returns as if nothing was said. These behaviors are often a sign not of strength or emotional maturity, but of psychic weakness. They lack the inner scaffolding required to hold two truths at once: the fact that they hurt someone and the fact that they can still choose to grow from it. Instead of holding both, they choose to drop yours. You are left with the full weight of the experience, carrying not only your pain, but also the confusion that follows when reality is denied by the very person who created it. What's worse, when you confront them, gently, reasonably, they may deflect, minimize, or even accuse you of making a big deal out of nothing, because to admit they did something wrong is to tear down the wall of their own moral comfort. They may say, "You're overreacting," or "That's not what I meant," or even worse, "I don't remember it that way." These responses are not always lies. They are the ego's desperate attempt to protect itself from collapse. It's easier to make you question your perception than to question their own integrity. This is the invisible cruelty of it all. The pain is not just caused by the act itself, but by the subtle, persistent gaslighting that follows, the rewriting of history in real time, the erasure of what you know you felt. And still, you are expected to carry on, to keep peace, to let it go, all while the wound remains open inside you, unseen and invalidated. This is how denial becomes a weapon dressed as normalcy. When someone hurts you and then refuses to acknowledge it, it often stems not just from denial, but from a profound emotional immaturity, a psychological state where responsibility feels threatening and uncomfortable truths are avoided at all costs. To step into accountability requires a level of self-awareness that is both rare and difficult. It demands that a person sit with discomfort, reflect on their behavior, and feel the full weight of how their actions have affected another. But emotional immaturity does not allow for this kind of internal confrontation. It shies away from anything that makes the self feel exposed, imperfect, or morally flawed. Instead of owning their part, the emotionally immature will dodge, redirect, or act as though nothing significant happened. They may even act overly cheerful, as if trying to reset the relationship to a pre-conflict state without actually doing the work of repair. This superficial peace is not built on healing, it's built on avoidance. And this avoidance is where the damage deepens. Because when someone lacks the emotional tools to face their mistakes, they instinctively seek ways to preserve their comfort, even if it means invalidating your reality in the process. These individuals are not necessarily malicious, but they are emotionally unequipped. They were never taught, or never chose, to develop the ability to tolerate emotional discomfort. They may have grown up in environments where accountability was punished rather than modeled, or where emotional honesty was seen as weakness. So when they hurt someone, they don't reflect, they retreat. They retreat into stories where they are innocent, misunderstood, or simply too overwhelmed to deal with the consequences. The moment you try to talk about your hurt, you threaten to pull them out of that safe space. And their reaction will likely not be one of listening or empathy, but of withdrawal, deflection, or defensiveness. This is the hallmark of emotional immaturity, not just the initial harm done, but the refusal to engage with the aftermath in any meaningful way. To the emotionally immature, apologizing feels like a surrender of power, a public admission of wrongdoing that triggers shame rather than growth. Instead of seeing apologies as a bridge to connection, they view them as a threat to their sense of control. As a result, they often rely on surface behaviors to smooth things over. They might joke, act as if everything is fine, or simply pretend the rupture never occurred. This isn't healing. It's a performance of normalcy, and it places the burden of emotional labor on the one who was hurt, forcing them to either accept the pretense or risk becoming difficult. By bringing up the past, there is also a deeper fear at work, a fear of being truly seen. To own how they've hurt someone would require them to look directly at the parts of themselves they've worked hard to conceal or deny, and for someone emotionally immature, this self-examination feels not like growth, but like exposure. Vulnerability, which is the first step toward healing, feels dangerous, so they armor themselves in avoidance. They maintain a kind of emotional distance even in close relationships, because closeness invites truth, and truth is what they are constantly evading. The tragedy is that many of these individuals genuinely care, but their care is not rooted in maturity. They may feel guilt in fleeting moments, but without the capacity to process it, they push it away. They may feel sadness when they see distance growing between you, but they won't connect it back to their own actions. Their empathy has limits, and those limits are defined by what they're able to face within themselves. In this way, your pain becomes a reflection they cannot bear to look at. So they minimize it, reframe it, or act like it never existed. And because they can't handle the depth of the wound they caused, they expect you to skim the surface with them, pretending the relationship remains intact when in truth it has been quietly cracked apart beneath the weight of everything that went unspoken. When someone hurts you and then proceeds to behave as if nothing happened, it is often because they never expected you to notice in the first place. This isn't about blindness, it's about calculation, often subconscious but very real. There are people who learn over time how to inflict subtle emotional damage without leaving obvious scars, how to push boundaries just enough to maintain control without provoking direct confrontation. They've mastered the art of inflicting harm in a way that stays beneath the threshold of obvious wrongdoing, relying heavily on your loyalty, your kindness, and your fear of conflict to keep you silent. They don't need you to be unaware, they just need you to stay quiet. They rely on the emotional contract they assume you've signed, the one where you don't speak up, don't disrupt, don't challenge the balance. When you finally begin to see clearly, when you start connecting the dots and naming the patterns, you break an unspoken rule. You disrupt the dynamic they were banking on. And it shocks them not because they are surprised at what they did, but because you were never supposed to call it out. These individuals often select their targets carefully, though not always consciously. They sense who is empathetic, who is peace-seeking, who is more likely to turn inward rather than lash outward when harmed. This is not about strength or weakness. It's about emotional wiring. They know intuitively who will try to understand rather than blame, who will rationalize their behavior, who will bend for the sake of preserving the relationship. They thrive in environments where their behavior is tolerated because it's not explosive, where the damage they cause is slow, cumulative, and quietly corrosive. The more you try to justify their actions to yourself, the more power they hold. And so, when you wake up from that spell, when you stop giving them the benefit of the doubt and start observing with clarity, they lose control over the narrative in this sense. Their pretending nothing happened is not just a defense mechanism, it's a strategic move. It's a way of maintaining the illusion that everything is fine so that you feel unreasonable for pointing out that it's not. If they act normal, you're expected to match that energy, or else you're seen as the problem. This is a deeply manipulative dynamic because it places the burden of emotional harmony entirely on you. You're the one carrying discomfort, and if you bring it up, you risk being labeled as confrontational, too sensitive, or even emotionally unstable. They create a situation where silence feels safer than truth, and that is the very trap they want you to stay in. What's more disturbing is how this dynamic is reinforced by society, especially in families, workplaces, or long-term relationships where peace is valued over authenticity. You're often rewarded for letting things go, for keeping the waters calm, for pretending right alongside them. Your ability to suppress your feelings is seen as maturity, while their avoidance is never questioned. And over time, you begin to doubt your own perception, wondering if maybe you are overreacting, if maybe you misunderstood the situation. This erosion of inner clarity is exactly what they count on. It keeps you locked in a cycle of doubt and self-blame while they remain untouched by accountability. But the moment you step out of this unspoken agreement, the moment you stop playing your role in their version of the story, you change everything. Your silence was part of the system that protected their comfort. Your awareness, now visible, becomes a threat, not because you're hostile or unkind, but because you now see through the performance. And when someone who once accepted harm begins to name it, it exposes the whole game. That exposure is what they fear most. Not your anger, not your disappointment, but your clarity. Because once you become clear, you become free. And once you're free, you can no longer be controlled with silence or guilt or scripted versions of connection that require you to betray yourself just to keep the peace they never truly earned in the first place. When someone hurts you and refuses to acknowledge it, they often go one step further. Not only do they act like nothing happened, but they twist the narrative so that you begin to question whether it was even wrong in the first place. This is not an accident, it's a defense mechanism, a projection of their own discomfort, guilt, or inner conflict onto you. Instead of holding space for the consequences of their behavior, they unload the emotional weight onto you, casting you as the overly sensitive one, the unstable one, the person who simply couldn't take a joke, couldn't let go, couldn't move on. They project their unresolved guilt outward because they cannot bear to contain it within themselves. This psychological maneuver allows them to keep their self-image clean while painting you as the source of disruption. The story shifts from "I hurt you" to "you're being difficult," and suddenly your justified pain becomes an inconvenience, an overreaction, or worse, a character flaw. This projection serves a critical function for them. It keeps their internal world undisturbed. If they allowed themselves to truly sit with the reality of your pain and the role they played in causing it, it would shatter the tidy illusion they've built of being good, reasonable, or caring. It would require them to see themselves in a light they've long denied, capable of causing harm, capable of betrayal, capable of disappointing someone who trusted them. That kind of awareness demands emotional courage, and for many, it's too much. So they take the easier route. They flip the script. They make you the reason the relationship feels strained. They make your reaction to the pain the real problem, rather than the pain itself. And because you are already in a vulnerable emotional state, it often works. You begin to replay the situation in your head, picking apart your tone, your words, the moment you brought it up, wondering if you could have handled it better, if maybe you misread the situation entirely. This is how projection slowly chips away at your inner clarity. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It plants quiet doubts, subtle shifts in perception, until you are no longer sure if your memory of the harm is even accurate. The more they deny, the more they deflect, the more you begin to carry the emotional debris of their behavior as if it were your own. This is where emotional confusion deepens. The harm they caused now comes packaged with a sense of shame and self-doubt, as though your reaction was more damaging than their action. This confusion is what they rely on to keep you quiet. If they can get you to turn your gaze inward and blame yourself, they never have to face the mirror. They've successfully offloaded the discomfort, and you're left holding not just the pain of the original wound, but the added burden of questioning your right to even feel it. Projection is not only a psychological defense, it's a relational strategy. It preserves their control. By turning the tables, they maintain the upper hand in the emotional dynamic. You become the one trying to make things right, trying to soothe the tension, trying to find the right words to explain your hurt in a way they might finally hear. And all the while, they remain emotionally distant, unavailable, and unaccountable. This imbalance is corrosive. It teaches you to silence your intuition, to distrust your perception, to constantly doubt your emotional responses. It conditions you to believe that harmony can only be maintained if you suppress your truth and absorb the blame that was never yours to begin with. And still, you might find yourself trying harder to be understood, trying harder to make peace, because somewhere deep down you believe that if you can just find the right words or the right tone, they'll finally see what they've done. But that clarity doesn't come from you explaining it better. It would require them to remove the blindfold they placed over their own eyes. Until then, No matter how honest or vulnerable you are, your truth will continue to bounce off a wall they refuse to acknowledge even exists. There is a quiet, immense power in being the one who sees clearly. When someone hurts you and acts like nothing happened, when they expect you to carry on as if everything is untouched and unchanged, they are relying on your silence to protect the illusion they've built. But the moment you stop participating in that illusion, the dynamic begins to shift in ways they cannot control. Awareness becomes your greatest defense. It pierces through manipulation, deflection, denial, and all the subtle strategies used to make you question your own experience. The act of seeing what actually happened, naming it without needing validation, is a turning point that many never reach, because it demands the courage to stand alone in the truth, even when everyone else is pretending otherwise. When you begin to recognize the patterns, the emotional loops, familiar discomfort that once kept you tethered to appeasement, you reclaim parts of yourself that had been slowly taken piece by piece. This doesn't mean you stop feeling pain. It means you begin to separate the pain from the confusion. You no longer chase apologies from those who would rather protect their comfort than honor your reality. You no longer internalize blame that was never yours to carry. You no longer wait for someone else's acknowledgement to begin your healing. This kind of awareness does not come with immediate relief, but it comes with strength, the strength to hold your own emotional ground, the strength to see clearly even when others are invested in your distortion. Clarity often feels like a burden at first, because it removes the false hope that someone will magically wake up and undo the harm they caused. It removes the illusion that healing can come from the person who hurt you, and while this is painful, it is also freeing. You begin to understand that your peace is not dependent on someone else's accountability. Your growth is not waiting for their permission. The person who sees clearly can no longer be controlled by guilt, tripping, by rewriting history, by the cyclical pattern of hurt and reconciliation that never truly reconciles. You stop accepting breadcrumbs in place of honesty. You stop playing the role of the understanding one while silently breaking inside. You stop normalizing the abnormal in order to avoid confrontation. And slowly, you begin to build a new relationship with yourself, one rooted in respect, boundaries, and truth. This is what those who hurt you and pretend not to notice often fear the most. Not your anger, not your silence, but your evolution. Because when you see through the pattern, when you begin to detach from the cycle, you become unpredictable to them. You no longer respond in the ways they've grown accustomed to. You no longer seek reassurance from the source of your pain. You are no longer complicit in their comfort, and that threatens the dynamic they relied on to remain unchallenged. Your awareness disrupts the emotional economy they benefited from. And once that balance is broken, they are left to face the void they've been avoiding. Being conscious doesn't mean being cold or unforgiving. It means refusing to abandon yourself in order to maintain a connection that thrives on your silence. It means choosing to stay awake even when it's easier to go numb. It means respecting your own intuition even when others call it dramatic, too sensitive, or exaggerated. And with every step you take in awareness, you become less reactive and more grounded. You stop begging for clarity from people who thrive in confusion. You stop explaining your worth to those who only listen when it benefits them. And you begin to live from a place that no longer demands outside permission to exist fully and honestly in your own truth. So when they hurt you and act like nothing happened, don't waste your energy demanding acknowledgement from those who are not yet capable of giving it. Their silence is not proof of your insignificance, it is evidence of their avoidance. Let your awareness be your boundary, let your growth be your answer, and above all, do not harden. Keep feeling, keep knowing, because the world doesn't need more people who hurt and forget, it needs more souls who remember and transform. Because the truth is simple. How they handle your pain reveals who they are. But how you rise from it, that reveals who you are.